My name is Aproop Ponnada. I am based in Singapore and I work in the clean energy industry. So I'm currently working at S&P Global as a sales specialist dealing with clean energy and carbon markets. I'm also currently still just about finishing my master's degree in energy transition from the University of Aberdeen. And I have a bachelor's in naval architecture from Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur.
Interesting. And why did you initially decide to study ocean engineering and naval architecture? Why that degree?
Right. So this was back in 2007. So I had the choice to either pick the stream I was going to study or the university I wanted to go to. So I could have done something a bit more conventional like civil or mechanical engineering from other universities. But at that time, I did not have a strong leaning towards what kind of engineering I wanted to do, and I felt the university was more important. And IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, is a well-renowned, established, reputed university in India. So I felt, okay, if I have the opportunity to go to this university, I will take the major that I'm able to get there. In which case, it turned out to be naval architecture.
Interesting. Why did you decide to study your master's in Aberdeen?
Well, the master's started about 4 years ago, and this was more than 10 years into my career by that point. I wanted something specifically in energy transition, so that term really started taking off, I think, just around COVID or pre-COVID. Uh, and up to that point in my career, both my title and my experience basically read naval architect, and I was keen to kind of establish my credentials in the clean technology space. And I felt energy transition was a good, broad enough topic for me to re-diversify my
Hmm.
expertise into this new domain that I wanted to get into.
Interesting. And if you had to how would you summarize your key milestones in your career that led you to your current role as a Director of Energy Transition at S&P Global?
Right. So I've had four roles at this point. So this is my fourth company, but my
Hmm.
fourth or fifth role. But I started as an engineer, so I obviously wanted to work in the field that I studied, which is naval architecture. So I worked as a naval architect for about 6, 7 years, and also as a subsea engineer, which is kind of related.
Hmm.
And the first turning point came when the oil prices started to crash in mid 2010s. So at that point, I felt my career was beginning to stagnate. I wanted to move away from oil and gas because I felt I was not comfortable with the uncertainty in the market. So I knew I wanted to get away, but I didn't have clarity on where I wanted to go
Yeah.
from there. And the digital wave was taking off at that time. So that was my first switch. I moved from the offshore oil and gas industry to digital applications in offshore oil and gas. So that was
Hmm.
the second role at Fugro. And by that point, the whole net zero story had also taken off, and I felt that idea of working in climate change and something sustainable resonated with me. So beyond the digital role, then I started realizing, okay, I want to stay in the energy
Yeah.
space, but I want to do something in the clean energy space. So that led to my second role at Fugro, where I was looking at the floating offshore wind industry, which was just about coming up again in the late around 2019, 2020 time frame. And from there on, it was just like finding the right opportunities that excited me. So then
Hmm.
I moved into consulting and a bit more broader sustainability beyond the offshore industry. So I was able to diversify a bit more. And this current role is kind of a continuation and focus on the clean tech space.
Interesting. That's very impressive career. And at McKinsey& and Company, you worked on a range of sustainability projects, including hydrogen market entry and decarbonized steel. Which of these projects had the highest impact and why?
Well, in consulting, as the audience might be familiar, projects are quite quick and very execution
Hmm.
focused. So it's typically an 8 to 10 week cycle. I would say the hydrogen one was one of my longer projects. So that was my first consulting project, and it was super cool to work on the strategy of an oil company that was trying to get into the clean tech space. That was one interesting one. I also worked on an international government project where I helped set up a fund on methane abatement specifically for the
Hmm.
ministry of a certain country. And that was also very interesting because it was quite a few steps away from the engineering core that I was maybe more familiar with.
Hmm.
but it gave me the opportunity to kind of think about the investment case for energy transition and how to work in an international kind of setting. So these are the two that come to my mind in terms of impactful and cool projects that I worked on.
Interesting. And during your time at Fugra, you were involved in technology development and market strategy. What were the biggest challenges in scaling floating offshore and offshore wind solutions?
Yeah, so floating wind, since I left that role, it's actually in a very interesting space now. It looked very, very cool and exciting in the 2019 time frame when offshore wind in general was going through a bit of a boom. But then COVID and inflation and all these political resistance started happening. So right now, floating wind is going through a bit of a struggle. But at the time, it was something that I was very familiar with, which is floating objects. I mean, as a naval architect, that's my bread and butter. And it was in the renewable space. So it brought together two areas I was very passionate and comfortable about. The challenge, I think, was that the market wasn't established, and it still isn't. But
Hmm.
there was, if you look at the engineering side of things, there were about 70 or so floating wind concepts at the time. And it wasn't clear which markets were going to take off. There was some activity happening in Japan, Korea, some activity in mostly the North Sea.
Hmm.
So the appreciation for the challenge of floating wind and the ability to sell solutions. Specifically, I was working in geoscience. So, for example, gathering seabed data or environmental data and why that is important to develop the floating wind industry. So, communicating the relevance of what my domain was doing in that space was a bit of a challenge because the industry was not fully scaled up and not everybody knew what it was. It sounded like an exotic idea. And to some extent, I think it still is.
Interesting. And well, the energy sector is undergoing rapid transformation. What trends do you believe will define the next decade of clean energy development?
I think two things come to mind. Like today, if you look at clean energy, it's a very political issue. It's always been, I mean, energy has always been about security and affordability, and of course, then the sustainability, the
Mhm.
so-called trilemma that people talk about. But today's world is highly polarized about the clean tech space. There's been an anti-ESG movement in the last few years. So that's one short-term trend. But I think what doesn't change, regardless of who's in the government, is the climate impact. And we're seeing more and more of it. And the impacts that we're seeing today are from the damage that we've done yesterday. So it's in a way exponential. Every year emissions are going up, and every year you'll see exponentially more impact. So I feel towards the later half of this decade, I think the political winds will again shift in favor of rapid action, even though it's expensive, because the general public is going to start seeing impacts and feeling the pain of climate change on a day-to-day basis. I think that's going to be the major like coming together of different parts of society and like bridging our differences and working towards a common cause. So right now it's politics. I
Mhm.
think in the medium term it's going to go back to let's make the planet more livable for us and future generations.
Yeah. Interesting. And what are the biggest barriers that are preventing faster adoption of renewable energy solutions in Southeast Asia?
Oh, that's a very interesting. I was just about to say it depends on which part of the world, but you got into Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is probably, other than sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's, if I remember my numbers correctly, it's the least penetration of renewables globally, in terms of level of investment as well. In theory, the resource is there, same as Africa. There's a lot of resource, and I think both markets face the challenge of unwillingness of financing projects there. In Southeast Asia, which I'm a bit familiar with, I think the challenge is it's probably one of the few places in the world where renewables are not automatically the cheapest power generation source. And that has a lot to do with how the power market is set up here. You have a lot of coal plants which are relatively young. You have a lot of industrial conglomerates and government-linked enterprises which are invested in these fossil fuel power generation assets. So you would have to pay for all of that before you can build solar or wind or batteries,
Mhm.
for example. And wind actually doesn't really blow that well here. So the macro challenge here is the replacement cost of renewables
Mhm.
makes it more expensive than the baseload generation that we have.
Mhm.
I think the other one is a general developing market risk. If you had $1 billion, would you invest in a technology and a region that you're comfortable in, or would you invest in, for example, Southeast Asia and renewables? So most investors shy away from the developing market risk of Southeast Asia. But that, having said that, it is changing. Parts of Southeast Asia are beginning to deploy a lot of batteries and solar. India is another example that comes to mind. It's a developing country, but it's now got, I think, the second largest installed base of renewables. So it takes systematic change, and that takes time, basically, long story short.
Interesting. And what was the biggest achievement in your career that you're the most proud of?
Um, I uh, I don't know if I can put my finger on something. I would say it's a general theme is my ability to adapt. I wouldn't call it an achievement, but it's a principle that I live by. So I've been able to pivot from building oil and gas structures to selling digital solutions, from selling digital solutions to advising clients in sustainability. And I've done some cool stuff in working with C-level. So I don't want to name specific milestones, I would say, but every transition that I've made in my career, I'm a little bit proud of, or being able to pick a completely new subject and do well, because it's always been a very first principles approach. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, it answers the question. Thank you. And the next question is, what advice do you have for students who are looking to build career in clean energy, carbon markets, or energy transition strategy? Basically, what you do, how to become as successful as you are.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say I'm super successful. I'm on a learning journey myself, but I would say keep your mind open. I mean, even if I look at my last 5 years as well, like from the time when I decided I wanted to do the master's, hydrogen was a big thing at that point in time. Now I'm more bullish about carbon markets. I've always felt renewables like are a big part of the solution. So if you have the willingness to explore and change your mind without doing it too much, broadly try to stay focused on one thematic area, but be willing to reinvent yourself and adapt yourself. I think now it's generative AI and like how can you use AI to be a more efficient engineer, for example. And that's something I'm trying to learn as well. But be open-minded. Don't decide the next 30 years or 40 years of your career today because it's a very long journey and there'll be many unexpected turns.
That's a great advice. And are there any books or podcasts you would recommend for our students?
That's interesting. I do listen to a lot of podcasts. I like Michael Liebreich. I listen to him a lot. He's a
Mm-hmm.
famous voice in the UK, especially. He's got a podcast called Cleaning Up,
Mm-hmm.
or Cleaning Up or Switched On. I don't remember which one it is, but I find that quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. See, interesting. And two more questions. In your opinion, what's the best way for students to utilize their like networking to benefit themselves? How can they do it
In
in
terms
that
of
way?
landing job opportunities
Yeah,
post university,
yeah, probably yeah.
yeah, I think what I feel I did not have enough of in my undergrad days, which I feel is a bit more easy now that I have industry experience, I have that perspective. But also the UK has a different, I would say, educational setup. There's always been an apprenticeship kind of legacy to the UK. When you're studying, you're also working
Yeah.
in the industry. So if you're doing a master's thesis project, and I think the University of Aberdeen is great because Aberdeen is like a big hub for oil and gas. There's always oil and gas and energy, sorry. There's always opportunities to work on real life problems,
Mm-hmm.
real life industrial applications. So try and if you are, of course, I can only speak from the perspective of working in industry post graduation. There's of course the academic route, which I can't speak to at that level. But I would say again, you might have a very cool project you want to think of. Maybe you want to use generative AI in designing some kind of floating wind structure. I don't know, I'm just making something
Mm-hmm.
up. You might think it's cool, but maybe there's no opportunities to work on it. So you could either do that as if you're passionate about the topic and develop your thesis around that, or you could look at what's happening in the market. And if I think of floating wind again, there's 5 offshore floating wind turbines just off the coast of Aberdeen, and there's challenges right now on maintaining them. I'm pretty sure there's an entire ecosystem built just around that small industry there. So there'll be opportunities to do your internships and your masters there. So in terms of networking, uh, using your studies and your projects as a way to build your reputation and show your credibility in the industry. I think is a good way to not only one, show what you're capable of, but also experience whether this is something you see yourself doing as a full-time job, like
Hmm.
an offshore maintenance engineer on a floating wind turbine. Like if you can experience that in your internship through your network and the university's network, that puts you in a better position when you're down to a career decision-making perspective once you graduate.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And the last question is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
My younger self,
Yeah.
um, I don't know, I would just say be more diplomatic, probably. It's the
Mm.
one that comes to mind. But that's something I'm learning every day again.